The ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas has entered a critical phase. Tensions are escalating following Israel's decision to halt the release of Palestinian prisoners. This move has significant implications for the ceasefire agreement. It also raises questions about the very future of this conflict. The ceasefire, which began in mid-January 2025, was brokered by 6 parties, including the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, to try and put an end to over 15 months of intense fighting in Gaza. The agreement involved the release of Israeli hostages who were held by Hamas in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners by Israel. The first phase of the ceasefire included the liberation of 25 living Israeli hostages and the bodies of 4 others, with Israel, on the other hand, agreeing to release more than 1,500 Palestinians who were in Israeli jails. By mid-February, 6 rounds of exchanges had occurred, freeing about 19 hostages. But the entire process has been disrupted with the last release of hostages.
Israel and America stand shoulder to shoulder in countering the threat of Iran.
Over the weekend, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that Israel would delay the release of over 600 Palestinian prisoners. He cited Hamas's humiliating ceremonies that were being done during the release of the Israeli hostages. It was basically a show of strength by Hamas. Netanyahu's point, his argument has been that these ceremonies, which included public displays and propaganda videos of Hamas, disrespected the hostages and were being used to further push Hamas propaganda. Now, the decision by Netanyahu to put a pause on the release of prisoners has been met with criticism from Hamas as well as other Arab countries who are viewing this as a breach of the ceasefire agreement. They're also calling this a bid to undermine the peace process. It also damages Netanyahu's own claim that Hamas's backbone has been broken with 15 months of intense military campaign. In fact, at every hostage for prisoner exchange, masked Hamas fighters have made a conspicuous presence every time there's been an exchange. The halt on prisoner releases has put the entire ceasefire agreement at risk. Hamas officials have said that negotiations with Israel are frozen until the release of all the remaining Palestinian prisoners. They emphasize that Israel's actions are a clear violation of the agreement that was arrived upon in conjunction with the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. The absence of an agreement for the next phase of the ceasefire, which is supposed to involve the release of all the remaining Israeli captives and a further permanent ceasefire, it complicates what is the precarious nature of the ongoing proceedings. The overall situation remains volatile. Over 46,000 Gazans have been killed and more than 1.9 million have been displaced, according to the Global Conflict Tracker. Netanyahu's statement that Israel is prepared to resume intense fighting at any moment suggests that the current stalemate could be used as a pretext to start hostilities again. This stand aligns with Israel's broader objectives in the conflict, one of which was to eliminate Hamas's military capabilities, and the other was to secure the release of all the hostages. Neither of these two objectives have been fully met, and it is apparent with each passing day that Hamas is very much in both military as well as political control of the Gaza Strip. Also, Netanyahu's own popularity ratings have been flagging. A latest New Arab survey shows that only 15% of Israelis want Netanyahu to continue as prime minister once the war is over. And Netanyahu realizes this. So, political opponents in Israel are saying Mr. Netanyahu is using this as a ruse to restart the war once again. The recent meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu and US President Donald Trump at the White House has been interpreted as a sign of support for Netanyahu to restart the war. In fact, Mr. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, is working to extend the first phase of the ceasefire and initiate the second phase, which would involve the release of more hostages and a more permanent ceasefire. But Trump's backing of Netanyahu could embolden Israel to take a much harder stand in the negotiations, and that could potentially undermine the efforts to maintain the ceasefire. Trump has told Israel in the presence of Netanyahu at the White House that he can do whatever the hell he wants to take the hostilities forward in Gaza. The current impasse raises concerns about the very future of Gaza. The humanitarian situation remains dire. Significant portions of the agreed-upon aid have been blocked from entering Gaza. the delay in the prisoner release and the potential collapse of the ceasefire could lead to renewed violence, and that would only further exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. According to the Times of Israel, a leading newspaper in Jerusalem, the next expected release involves the remains of 4 hostages who are dead. That's been scheduled for later this week, but this temporary delay has brought serious doubts whether the February 27th scheduled exchange of hostage bodies for prisoners will actually go ahead or not. The first phase of this ceasefire was set to conclude by the early part of March. It includes further hostage releases and prisoner exchanges. 14 more hostages are still slated for release. Hamas, though, has claimed out of this 14, 6 are dead. The current state of the Israel-Hamas conflict is precarious. Israel's halt on the prisoner release is threatening to derail the ceasefire. Netanyahu's justification for this decision is centered on the manner of the release of hostages. That's been criticized by Hamas as a pretext to undermine the peace process. If negotiations fail, Israel might resume military operations, potentially once again targeting Hamas leadership and targeting Hamas's terror infrastructure. Hamas, on the other hand, could retaliate with rocket attacks. So basically, it would be back to square one. It would be similar to the pre-October 7, 2023 situation, which renders the very purpose of this military operation meaningless. There's also the added humanitarian crisis, with 90% of Gazans facing food insecurity and no functioning hospitals as per the Global Conflict Tracker. This could worsen and lead to further casualties. As tensions escalate, the risk of renewed conflict is growing, potentially leading to further bloodshed and destabilization in the Gaza Strip. The international community, including the United States, faces a challenge in mediating a resolution that satisfies both parties and prevents the collapse of the ceasefire. The situation in Gaza remains volatile. The future of the very ceasefire is hanging in the balance. The next steps taken by both Israel and Hamas will be crucial in determining whether the conflict escalates or whether a path towards peace can be secured.